The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop at the dusty station in Amarillo, Texas, its brakes hissing like an angry rattlesnake. Through the grimy window, 73-year-old Martha Coleman clutched a worn leather envelope to her chest, her weathered hands trembling not from age but from anticipation. Inside that envelope lay the deed to the Broken Arrow Ranch, 500 acres of prime Texas land that had been in her late husband's family for 3 generations. "This is it, Jake," she whispered to herself, practicing the words she'd rehearsed for the entire 14-hour journey from Phoenix. "This is your chance to come home." Her son, Jake Coleman, hadn't spoken to her in over 2 years. Not since the funeral, not since the reading of his father's will that left everything to Martha instead of him. Jake had stormed out that day, his boots echoing through the funeral home like gunshots, leaving behind only bitter words that still echoed in Martha's mind. "You turned him against me, Ma. Don't ever expect to see me again." But today was different. Today, Martha was going to make things right. She stepped off the bus into the scorching Texas heat, her floral dress clinging to her small frame. The bus station was nearly empty, except for a sleeping homeless man and a clerk behind bulletproof glass who barely glanced up from his phone. Martha checked the crumpled piece of paper in her purse, Jake's address, which she'd gotten from his ex-wife Sarah after months of pleading phone calls. "He's been working construction," Sarah had told her during their last conversation, "barely making ends meet, living in some rundown apartment near the stockyards. Martha, he's not the same man you remember. The drinking, the anger, it's gotten worse." Martha had listened to every word, her heart breaking a little more with each detail. Her Jake, the boy who used to help his father mend fences and whisper secrets to the horses, had become a stranger, consumed by resentment. The taxi ride to Jake's apartment complex took 20 minutes through increasingly rough neighborhoods. Martha watched the scenery change from modest suburban homes to chain-link fences and graffitied walls. When they finally stopped in front of a 2-story building with peeling paint and broken mailboxes, Martha's resolve wavered for just a moment. "You sure this is the right place, lady?" the taxi driver asked, concern evident in his voice. "Yes," Martha replied, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "This is where my son lives." She paid the fare and stood on the cracked sidewalk, clutching the leather envelope tighter. The apartment number was 2B, 2nd floor, 3rd door on the left. Sarah had been very specific. Martha climbed the rusty external staircase, each step echoing her racing heartbeat. When she reached Jake's door, she could hear voices inside, angry voices. Through the thin walls, she recognized her son's deep baritone, though it was slurred and hostile. "I don't care what the foreman said, Rick. I'll show up when I show up." "Jake, man, you're gonna get fired if you keep this up," another voice responded. "This is the 3rd job this year. At some point, you gotta face reality." "Reality?" Jake's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Reality is that my old man left everything to his perfect little wife, instead of the son who broke his back working that ranch for 20 years. Reality is that I'm 38 years old and sleeping on a mattress on the floor because I can't even afford decent furniture." Martha's heart clenched. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe Jake wasn't ready for this conversation. Maybe she should have called first or sent a letter, or... The door suddenly swung open, and there stood her son. Jake Coleman was a shadow of the man she remembered. His face was gaunt, covered by a scraggly beard, and his blue eyes, so much like his father's, were bloodshot and empty. He wore a stained tank top that revealed arms still muscled from construction work, but marked with new scars and old bruises. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jake's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something that looked almost like pain, before hardening into familiar anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" His words came out like bullets. "Jake," Martha whispered, her voice breaking slightly. I came to see you." "Well, you've seen me. Now get lost." He started to close the door, but Martha stepped forward. "Wait, please. I have something that belongs to you." Jake paused, his eyes narrowing as they fell on the leather envelope in her hands. "What is that?" "It's the deed to the Broken Arrow Ranch," Martha said, her words rushing together. "I'm giving it to you. It should have been yours from the beginning. Your father, he was angry. You know how stubborn he could be, but he never stopped loving you. And neither have I." Jake stared at the envelope like it might explode. Behind him, his friend Rick appeared in the doorway, clearly sensing the tension. "Is this some kind of joke?" Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. "No joke. I've had the lawyers draw up all the paperwork. The ranch is yours, Jake. 500 acres, the house, the stables, everything. All you have to do is sign the transfer papers and And what? Jake's voice rose, attracting attention from neighbors. Pretend like the last 2 years never happened. Pretend like you didn't poison my father against me. Pretend like you actually give a damn about me now. I've always cared about you, Martha said, tears beginning to flow down her weathered cheeks. You're my son. You're all I have left. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your son. Lady, your son died the day you let his father write him out of the will. What you're looking at now is just the ghost. The words hit Martha like physical blows. She clutched the envelope tighter, as if it could somehow bridge the chasm between them. Jake, please, just listen to me. Let me explain what really happened with your father's will. Let me tell you why I don't want to hear it, Jake shouted, his face flushing red. I don't want your explanations. I don't want your guilt money, and I sure as hell don't want your pity. You made your choice 2 years ago, now live with it. He slammed the door so hard that the entire building seemed to shake. Martha stood there for a long moment, staring at the peeling paint and crooked numbers that spelled out 2B. From inside, she could hear Jake's voice, muffled but still angry, and Rick's attempts to calm him down. Slowly, Martha turned and walked back down the rusted staircase. Her legs felt unsteady, and she had to grip the railing tighter with each step. When she reached the sidewalk, she looked up at Jake's window and saw a curtain twitch, as if someone had been watching her leave. The leather envelope felt heavier now, weighted with rejection and lost hope. Martha walked to the corner where she'd seen a bus stop sign, her small suitcase rolling behind her on uneven wheels. According to the posted schedule, the next bus back to Phoenix wouldn't arrive for 3 hours. She sat down on the metal bench, still clutching the deed to the ranch that her son didn't want, and began to cry, not just for the conversation that had gone so wrong, but for the years of silence, the misunderstandings, and the family that seemed broken beyond repair. What Martha didn't know was that 2 blocks away, Jake Coleman was standing at his window, watching her small figure on that bench, his own eyes wet with tears he refused to acknowledge. Tears for the mother he'd pushed away, and the ranch he'd convinced himself he no longer wanted. The deed to his dreams sat between them like an unbridgeable canyon, and neither knew how to take the first step across. Tell us, what city or country are you watching this story from? It's always incredible to know how far these narratives reach. 3 hours. Martha had been sitting on that bus bench for 3 hours, watching the Texas sun creep across the cracked pavement, while strangers passed by without a second glance. Her floral dress was now damp with perspiration, and the leather envelope containing the ranch deed had left permanent creases in her palms from gripping it so tightly. She'd replayed the confrontation with Jake at least a dozen times, each mental replay making her heart ache more. The hatred in his eyes, the way he'd called her lady instead of mom, the door slamming with such finality, it all felt like losing him all over again. But Martha Coleman hadn't survived 73 years by giving up easily. 2 blocks away, Jake was pacing his cramped apartment like a caged animal, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on his kitchen counter, and his friend Rick sitting at the wobbly card table they used for dining. "You're an idiot, Jake," Rick said bluntly, not bothering to sugarcoat his words. "Your mother just offered you a ranch and you slammed the door in her face." "She's not my mother," Jake muttered, taking another swig from the bottle. "Not anymore." "Right, because mothers stop being mothers when they make mistakes." Rick's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Tell me again what exactly she did that was so unforgivable, because from where I'm sitting it sounds like she just lost her husband and got stuck with property she didn't even want." Jake whirled around, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. "She turned him against me. My own father wrote me out of his will because of her poison whispers. 20 years I worked that ranch, Rick. 20 years of mending fences in the freezing cold, birthing calves at 3 in the morning, sacrificing everything for that land. And for what? So she could waltz in and play the grieving widow? Or," Rick said carefully, "maybe there's more to the story than you know." Jake's laugh was bitter. "Trust me, I know exactly what happened. She convinced him I was a disappointment, that I'd drink away the ranch or gamble it, or..." He stopped mid-sentence, suddenly aware of the irony. Here he was, drunk at 2 in the afternoon, living in squalor, exactly the kind of man his father had apparently thought he'd become. Rick noticed the pause. "When's the last time you actually talked to your dad? I mean, really talked, not just grunted good morning over coffee." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the bus stop, where he knew his mother was waiting. "The night before he died," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did you talk about?" "Nothing. Everything." Jake sat heavily on his mattress, suddenly looking older than his 38 years. "He was in the hospital, on all those machines. I was sitting next to his bed and he..." He tried to say something, but I was so angry about some stupid argument we'd had earlier that week. I told him to save his strength. I said we'd talk when he got better. Rick waited, sensing there was more. But he kept trying to talk, kept reaching for my hand. Jake's voice cracked. I left. I told him I had to get back to the ranch, check on the cattle. I left him there alone because I was too proud to listen. Jesus, Jake. He died that night, 3 hours after I left. Ma was there, holding his hand. The nurses said his last words were about me, but Ma never told me what he said. At the funeral, when the lawyer read the will and everything went to her, I just assumed. I thought she'd convinced him to punish me. Rick was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Did you ever ask her what his last words were? No. Jake took another drink. I was too busy hating her. Meanwhile, at the bus stop, Martha was having her own reckoning with the past. An elderly black man had joined her on the bench, wearing overalls and a cowboy hat that had seen better days. Waiting for the Phoenix bus? He asked kindly. Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. Long journey. I'm heading to El Paso myself, name's Samuel. He extended a weathered hand. Martha, she managed, shaking his hand weakly. Samuel studied her face with the kind of wisdom that comes from decades of living. Forgive me for saying so, ma'am, but you look like someone carrying a heavy burden. Something about his gentle manner broke through Martha's reserve. I came here to see my son, to give him something that belonged to his father, but he won't even talk to me. Family troubles are the hardest kind, Samuel said with a knowing nod. What did his father leave him? A ranch, 500 acres in Montana that's been in his family for generations. But my husband, he left it to me instead of Jake, and Jake thinks I manipulated him into doing it. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Did you? No, Martha's voice was firm, but I let Jake believe that I did, because the truth is more complicated. Truth usually is. Martha was quiet for a moment, then found herself telling this stranger things she'd never told anyone. My husband was dying of cancer for 8 months before Jake knew. He made me promise not to tell him, because he knew Jake would quit everything to take care of him. The ranch was struggling financially. We'd had 3 bad years in a row, drought and cattle disease. My husband had taken out loans against the property just to keep it running. Samuel listened without interruption. The only way to save the ranch was to transfer it to me first, so I could sell off some of the land to developers and use that money to pay the debts. Then, once everything was clear, I was supposed to transfer it back to Jake. That was always the plan. But you never got the chance to explain. He wouldn't listen. At the funeral, when he heard the will, he just exploded. Started screaming about how I'd stolen his inheritance, how his father had chosen his wife over his son. I tried to tell him the truth, but he stormed out. That was 2 years ago. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, digesting this information. And now? Now I've cleared all the debts, sold just enough land to make the ranch profitable again. It's ready for him, better than it's ever been. But he won't even let me explain. Some wounds take time to heal, Samuel said gently, but that doesn't mean they can't be healed. As if summoned by their conversation, Jake appeared at the end of the block, walking slowly toward the bus stop. He looked smaller somehow, less angry, more lost. Martha saw him coming and felt her heart leap into her throat. This was it. Either her last chance or another heartbreak. Jake stopped about 10 feet away, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, unable to meet her eyes. "Ma," he said quietly, the word carrying 2 years of pain and confusion. "Jake," she whispered back. Samuel quietly stood up and moved to give them privacy, tipping his hat to Martha as he went. Jake started, then stopped. "Rick said I should ask you something, about Dad's last words." Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. "Oh, Jake. Oh, honey. What did he say, Ma? What were his last words?" Martha clutched the deed envelope tighter, knowing that everything, their future, their family, their chance at healing, hinged on this moment. If this story is touching you in some way, comment where you're watching us from. Each place has its own pain, and sometimes it's incredible to see how we all connect through such human stories. Martha's hands trembled as she looked at her son standing 10 feet away, his question hanging in the air like morning mist over a Texas field. "What did he say, Ma? What were his last words?" She closed her eyes, transported back to that sterile hospital room 2 years ago, the steady beep of machines, the antiseptic smell, and Thomas Coleman's weathered hand growing cold in hers. "He said," Martha's voice broke, then steadied. "He said, 'Tell Jake I'm sorry, tell him the ranch was always his, tell him I was just trying to save it for him.'" Jake's face crumpled like paper thrown in a fire. He took a step closer, then stopped as if an invisible wall stood between them. He wanted to explain everything to you that last night, Martha continued, her words flowing like water through a broken dam. When you visited him in the hospital, he had all the papers ready, the loan documents, the bank statements, everything that showed why we had to do what we did. But you left before I could listen, Jake finished, his voice hollow with realization. Martha nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. He made me promise to wait until you were ready to hear the truth. He said you needed time to grieve, to heal from the anger. But Jake, honey, it's been 2 years and I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't let you go on thinking your father didn't love you. Jake's legs seemed to give out, and he sank onto the bus bench beside his mother, his head in his hands. God, Ma, what have I done? What have I become? For the first time in 2 years, Martha reached out and touched her son's shoulder. He didn't pull away. You became hurt, she said gently. You became a man who lost his father and thought he'd lost his father's love too. There's no shame in that kind of pain, Jake. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the Texas heat shimmer off the asphalt. Finally, Jake raised his head and looked at the leather envelope his mother still held. The ranch, he said quietly. You said you saved it? Martha nodded. I sold 40 acres to a developer. The back section that was always too rocky for cattle anyway. Paid off all the loans, fixed the irrigation system, even had the house painted. It's beautiful, Jake. The way your father always dreamed it could be. And you're just giving it to me after everything I said to you? After I abandoned you? You're my son, Martha said simply, and it was never mine to keep. I was just the caretaker until you were ready to come home. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. Then he asked the question that had been eating at him for 2 years. Why didn't you tell me about Dad's cancer? Why did you let me find out at the funeral home? Martha's face aged 10 years in an instant. Because he begged me not to. He said if you knew he was dying, you'd drop everything to take care of him. You'd give up your construction apprenticeship, your life in Denver, everything you'd worked for. He wanted you to have choices, Jake. He wanted you to choose the ranch because you loved it, not because you felt obligated. But I would have come home anyway. We know, and that's exactly why he didn't want to tell you. He said, my boy's got too big a heart for his own good. He'll sacrifice his future for my past, and I won't let that happen. Jake laughed through his tears, a sound Martha hadn't heard in years. Stubborn old man. Gets it from both sides of the family, Martha said, giving him a pointed look. They shared a moment of understanding, the first real connection they'd had since Thomas's funeral. But then Jake's expression grew serious again. Ma, I need to tell you something. About these past 2 years, about who I've become. He gestured toward his apartment building. I'm not the man Dad thought I was. I'm not the man who deserves a ranch. What do you mean? Jake's voice was raw with honesty. I drink too much. I can't hold a job. I live like an animal in a place that's falling apart. I've been angry for so long, I don't remember how to be anything else. What if Dad was wrong? What if I really would just ruin everything he worked for? Martha studied her son's face, the premature lines around his eyes, the weight of failure in his shoulders, the fear that he might not be worthy of redemption. Jake Coleman, she said firmly, do you remember what your father used to say about breaking horses? Jake looked confused by the change in topic, but nodded. He said you can't break a horse by beating the spirit out of it. You have to earn its trust. And what else? That every horse is worth saving, even the ones that have been hurt the worst. Martha smiled. Your father saw something in every wounded thing that crossed his path. He saw potential where others saw problems, and he saw that same potential in you, even on his deathbed. She held out the leather envelope. This isn't charity, Jake. This isn't guilt or pity. This is faith. Faith that underneath all that anger and hurt is still the boy who used to whisper secrets to horses and fix fences in the snow. Jake stared at the envelope, but didn't take it. What if I'm not that boy anymore? Then you become him again, Martha said simply. One day at a time, one fence at a time, one sober morning at a time. For the first time since she'd arrived, Jake really looked at his mother, not through the filter of resentment or pain, but with clear eyes. He saw the lines that grief had carved into her face, the weight she'd carried alone for 2 years, the love that had brought her halfway across the country to find her lost son. I'm scared, Ma, he admitted quietly. Of what? Of failing him again. Of failing you. Of proving that I really am the disappointment everyone thinks I am. Martha took his hand in both of hers, the same hands that had comforted him through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks. Jake, listen to me. Your father's last words weren't the only thing he said that night. After the doctors left, after visiting hours were over, he looked at me and said, Martha, promise me something. When Jake's ready to hear this, when he's ready to come home, Don't let him come back as the man he thinks he has to be. Let him come back as the man he actually is. Jake felt something shift inside his chest, like a door that had been locked for 2 years suddenly swinging open. The man I actually am? The man who loves the land more than anything. The man who has gentle hands with hurt animals. The man who makes mistakes but owns them. The man who gets knocked down but gets back up. Martha's voice grew stronger with each word. The man who's been hiding under all that anger and hurt, waiting for someone to call him home. Jake finally reached out and took the envelope, his fingers tracing the worn leather. "Come home, Jake," Martha whispered. "Come home." Cowboy left his elderly mother at the bus stop. She was carrying the deed to his dream ranch. 6 months later, the first frost of winter painted the Montana landscape in silver as Jake Coleman stood on the wraparound porch of the Broken Arrow ranch house, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands. The sun was just breaking over the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across 500 acres of pristine ranch land that he still couldn't quite believe belonged to him. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Nothing worthwhile ever does. The first month had been the hardest. Jake had arrived in Montana with nothing but a duffel bag, a pickup truck that barely ran, and 2 years' worth of bad habits that fought him every step of the way. The ranch house, beautifully restored by his mother, had felt too clean, too hopeful for the broken man he'd become. He'd found his father's old journal in the desk drawer of the ranch office, filled with entries about financial struggles, sleepless nights worrying about Jake's future, and detailed plans for saving the ranch. One entry, dated just 3 weeks before his death, had brought Jake to his knees. "Jake came by the hospital today, but I could see the anger in his eyes. He thinks I don't trust him with the ranch, but the truth is I trust him more than anyone. That's why I have to save it first. A man can't build his dreams on a foundation of debt and desperation. I just pray he'll understand someday that everything I'm doing is for him." Jake had cried for 3 hours that night, the first tears he'd shed since his father's funeral. The physical work of running the ranch had been his salvation. Each morning, he'd forced himself out of bed before dawn, working the land until his body ached too much for his mind to wander into dark places. He'd repaired fences that didn't need repairing, reorganized barns that were already organized, and slowly, methodically rebuilt his relationship with sobriety one day at a time. Martha had stayed for the first 2 months, not interfering, just being present. She'd cooked meals he sometimes couldn't eat, sat quietly while he struggled with withdrawal, and held him the night he'd finally broken down completely, and told her about all the jobs he'd lost, all the bridges he'd burned, all the ways he'd disappointed the man whose name was carved on the ranch's entrance gate. "Your father was never disappointed in you," she'd said that night. "He was disappointed for you. There's a difference, Jake. One is judgment, the other is love." Now, 6 months later, Jake barely recognized the man he'd become. His hands, once soft from months of unemployment and neglect, were calloused again from honest work. His eyes, once bloodshot and hollow, were clear and focused. The ranch was thriving under his care. The cattle were healthy, the finances were stable, and he'd even started talking to neighboring ranchers about cooperative breeding programs. But the most important change wasn't visible to the outside world. "You're up early," came a familiar voice from behind him. Jake turned to see Rick walking up the porch steps, carrying his own cup of coffee. His old friend had driven up from Texas the night before for what had become a monthly tradition, a weekend visit to check on Jake's progress and help with whatever projects needed extra hands. "Been up for an hour," Jake replied. "Watching the sunrise never gets old up here." Rick joined him at the porch railing, surveying the peaceful ranch landscape. "You know, when you first told me you were moving to Montana, I thought you'd lost your mind. Now I'm thinking about asking if you need a ranch hand." Jake smiled. "The offer's always open, though I should warn you the boss is pretty demanding." "Yeah? What's he like?" "Sober," Jake said simply. "That makes all the difference." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the ranch come alive with the morning light. In the distance, a small herd of cattle grazed contentedly in the north pasture, cattle that Jake had purchased with his first profit from the ranch, using breeding techniques his father had taught him 20 years ago. "Your mom called yesterday," Rick said eventually. "She wanted to make sure I reminded you about Christmas." Jake nodded. "I know. First Christmas we'll spend together in 3 years. She's nervous." "Are you?" Jake considered the question carefully. "No. Grateful, maybe, but not nervous. We've done the hard work already." A truck appeared on the distant road leading to the ranch, kicking up a small cloud of dust. As it got closer, Jake recognized the vehicle. It was Martha's rental car from the airport in Billings. "She's early," Jake said, but he was smiling. The truck pulled up to the house, and Martha climbed out, looking smaller in her winter coat, but moving with the energy of someone who had found her purpose again. She'd been living in Phoenix since Jake took over the ranch, but they talked every week, and she visited once a month to see how he was progressing. "Morning, boys," she called out, climbing the porch steps with a large bag in her arms. "I brought supplies for Christmas dinner." "Ma, Christmas is still 4 days away," Jake said, but he hugged her tightly. "I know, but I also brought something else." Her eyes were bright with excitement. "Something I've been saving for the right moment." She reached into her bag and pulled out an old wooden box, worn smooth by decades of handling. Jake recognized it immediately, his father's memory box, where he'd kept important documents, photographs, and mementos from their life on the ranch. "I thought you might want to go through this together," Martha said. "There are things in here about the ranch's history, about your grandfather and great-grandfather, stories your father wanted to share with you when you were ready." Jake took the box with reverent hands, feeling the weight of generations in the smooth wood. "There's also a letter in there," Martha added quietly. "Your father wrote it the night before he went into the hospital for the last time. It's addressed to you." Jake's breath caught. "A letter? He said I should give it to you when you found your way home. Not to the ranch, to yourself." Rick quietly excused himself, sensing this was a moment for family. Jake and Martha sat together on the porch swing his father had built 30 years ago, the wooden box between them. With trembling fingers, Jake opened the box and found the letter on top, his name written in his father's familiar handwriting. The envelope was thick, suggesting multiple pages of thoughts his father had wanted to share. "Do you want me to leave you alone to read it?" Martha asked. Jake shook his head. "No, Ma. Stay. We've had enough years of doing things alone." He opened the envelope and began to read aloud, his father's words carrying across the Montana morning like a blessing. "My dear son, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to the land that loves you as much as you love it. It means your mother kept her promise to wait until you were ready. It means you've forgiven an old man's clumsy attempts to secure your future." As Jake read, Martha watched her son's face transform with each paragraph, years of doubt and resentment melting away like spring snow. The letter contained everything Thomas Coleman had wanted to tell his son, but hadn't found the words for while he was alive. Pride in Jake's character, faith in his abilities, and dreams for the ranch's future under his care. When Jake finished reading, they sat in silence, watching the Montana wind move through the grass like invisible hands blessing the land. "He knew," Jake said finally. "He knew exactly who I was, even when I didn't." "That's what fathers do," Martha replied. "They see the man you're becoming even when you can only see the boy you used to be." Jake folded the letter carefully and looked out over the ranch, his ranch, with new eyes. Every fence post, every blade of grass, every distant mountain peak was part of a legacy that stretched back 3 generations and would continue forward for generations to come. "Ma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you for waiting, for believing, for bringing me home." Martha took his hand, the same hands that had once been soft with neglect, but were now strong with purpose. "Welcome home, Jake," she whispered. "Your father would be so proud." In the distance, a hawk circled over the pasture, its cry echoing across the land like a benediction. The Broken Arrow Ranch was whole again, and so was the family that called it home. And now that you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Your presence matters, and so does your story. Cowboy left his elderly mother at the bus stop. She was carrying the deed to his dream ranch,